Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the point that those of us who remain are clearly the marathon runners rather than the sprinters. But I hope you agree it's been a pretty worthwhile long-distance haul, and we have only one session to go. Just to let you know what I'm planning to do with it, I'll aim for roughly a 4 o'clock finish with this panel. And at about that time, President SBY will come back into the room. I will then just do some final concluding remarks. You'll be pleased to hear I don't intend to give you a summary of the last 2 days' worth of proceedings or anything like it, but just a few concluding thoughts and thank the President. And then we will be done by around about 4 o'clock, I think, and there will be afternoon tea after that. So what I'm hoping to do with this final session here is to end simply with an opportunity for 3 of our feisty panel members to end with some concluding thoughts about the white paper, about the current strategic situation, about interests, about their reactions to some of the discussions that we've had over the last 2 days, partly by way of almost thinking about, well, what is the agenda which now has to be considered as we return to our theme of from the page to reality. Now, each of our speakers has already had a turn up on the stage, so I'm not going to go through their bios again. Andrew Davies will speak first, followed by Mike Green, then Tim Huxley, 5 to 7 minutes each, if you're being really interesting and engaging, perhaps 8 or 9 minutes, and then into conversation. So, Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Well, with 2 big picture guys sitting here beside me, both of whom bring an international perspective, I thought I'd just sum up by talking about how we're going to get from the page to reality as far as a relatively small picture local view goes, and I'm just going to focus on the ADF force structure. And lest you think that $190 billion of investment isn't a small picture thing, to put that in perspective, it's half a joint strike fighter program. So, on global scales, it kind of fits. So let me look at the challenges I see, and I've split the challenges up into 4 categories, but they're certainly not mutually exclusive. Things that happen in any one of the categories can affect the others. But technical and project management, I think, is a big challenge we're going to have, spending that amount of money. There are political challenges ahead. There are organisational challenges within the Department of Defence, and there are always externalities that could turn up. In terms of technical and project management, if we're going to start cutting steel on the OPV in 2 years' time and the future frigate in 4 years' time, that's a lot of designing that has to be done, a lot of requirements that need to be locked in. If there's one thing that the world of project management tells us, and that would be starting cutting steel on a project before the requirements are nailed down is a really bad idea. So that's one big challenge right in front of us up front. Finding the industrial capacity to farm out $190 billion worth of work is a challenge as well. We've had trouble spending some of the money that was around under the Howard government when the sums were considerably less than that. I think there's a question about the expertise within the Department of Defence in terms of both how it's organised and in just having the bodies to provide adult supervision for that sort of scale of work. The ADF is going to have to be integrating some demanding new platforms with whole new concepts of operation. Air Force, with their Project Jericho, have gone quite a way towards thinking about it, but I'm still not 100% sure they know exactly what they're in for with things like the F-35 and with Triton. The data streams are going to be fire hoses. There's disruptive technologies on the horizon. We don't know yet just how disruptive they're going to be, but they're probably going to interfere in the delivery of this program somewhere in the next 10, 20, even 30 years. Things like swarms of UAVs, autonomous unmanned systems, or even swarms of autonomous unmanned systems will probably change the way that militaries do business in ways that we don't really understand at the moment. We're also, in terms of project management, we're moving to do more here and probably less through avenues like FMS. And to be blunt, that's at odds with project performance data since the end of the very successful Anzac frigate project. The last 10 years have shown us that the projects that are on time and on budget are the ones that are FMS. If we're going to do more here, we're going to see less on time and less on budget. I mentioned the organisational challenges before that CASG have. They're still bedding down the changes that came with the first principles review. We don't know yet exactly what Gate 0 looks like, and one of the notes I've got here is that we really need to avoid gate creep. If you remember the Kinnaird reforms, first pass was meant to be a look at it to make sure it was sensible. You throw out the silly alternatives, winnow it down to a few sensible ones, and it has grown over time to a bureaucratic exercise that requires 50 plus supporting documents and almost tender level information to get first pass approval. It was never the intention. If Gate 0 does the same thing, we're just going to slow the whole process down by yet another series of 50 bureaucratic documents. At the government level, there's a question as to whether the National Security Committee will cope with the workflow for the approvals they'll have to make to spend that amount of money. In fact, I think I'd extend that to say I'm not sure that anyone from the Department of Defence, the Department of Finance, the government itself can actually cope with that workload. Politically, we're again seeing defence industry policy being used as an ersatz national industry policy. And I think that's twice dumb. It's dumb because it reduces the efficiency with which defence capability is produced through expenditure, and the scale of the defence industry can't make a significant change to the national industry landscape. So trying to use defence industry to get national industry outcomes, I think is a disconnect, but it's something we're likely to see, and we're likely to see a lot of it over the next 12 weeks or so if as everyone suspects, there's an election in July. And I think the election campaign could lead to rushed and suboptimal decisions, and probably inefficient investment as well. 12 weeks from now, we could have a new government and a new Minister for Defence who has no particular attachment to the white paper we've spent the last 2 days talking about. And in years to come, as Mark and Saul pointed out so eloquently this morning, every year the government sits down to work out its budget, it's going to be faced with opportunity costs, it's going to be faced with revenue projections that are different from the ones we have today, and growth projections different from the ones we have today. The idea that the defence expenditure envelope that we've seen in this white paper will still be in place 10 years from now, I think is unlikely. Externalities. Who knows what the global economy will do, and who knows what the regional security picture will look like in 5 years. The South China Sea could easily get worse, but it could also get better. Japan's security posture is forward-leaning at the moment. Who knows what a change of government in Japan in a few years' time might do. American engagement in the region could decrease, or, depending on the nature of the next administration, it could also increase. And we don't really know what climate change will do in terms of destabilising populations and nations in our parts of the world. So what does that all mean? Well, it means, first of all, that not everything in this defence white paper is going to happen. Some of the proposals in there will be overtaken by technological developments and or external events. We'll change our mind about priorities. Things will happen and we'll change our mind about where we want to spend our defence money. The budgets might well change. We could screw up the implementation of projects. We saw with the 2000 Defence White Paper, the one that's come closest to being implemented, the Sea Sprite helicopter got cancelled after $1.4 billion worth of expenditure. The Tiger helicopter is going to limp into the 2020s, but not far beyond. We'll just get some things wrong. And some of the things we haven't planned will happen. Places we haven't thought much about will suddenly become important. Things will be bought that we're not planning to buy now, and things that have happened over the last 10 years. C-17s, we were going to replace the C-130 fleet. Now we've got a fleet of wonderful new C-17s. We've bought Super Hornets, which have displaced a squadron of F-35s, at least for now. HMAS Choules was going to be a new vessel, and we saw one going cheap in the classifieds. So things like that will happen from time to time. And of course, the rapid force protection measures that were introduced in Afghanistan were driven by the most pressing of externalities, and that is battlefield casualties. So we'll end up doing things that we're not planning to do now. And at the end of the day, if a similar group gets together 10 years from now, we'll see that we'll have got some things wrong, and then we've mostly got them right. And there'll be some inefficiencies and some heartache and some unfortunate headlines along the way. But at the end of that, the ADF will have more capability and capacity than it has now. Industry will get more work than it has now. Governments will change and defence will go on. And if defence gets a government that it doesn't like, it will do what it's always done and wait it out. There'll be another defence white paper between now and the 10-year anniversary of today. And there'll be a room full of people arguing about what should be in it. That's the one thing you can take to the bank. Thank you.
Well, he's a cheerful fellow, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, I should say Andrew and I are available to do children's birthday parties. Usually by the end of the party, they run from the room saying, "Mummy, I don't want to be a strategist anymore."
Yeah, we do the good strategist, bad strategist routine.
It does occur to me that a rule for future white papers is that they shouldn't take any longer than the average tenure of the last 10 defence ministers would be one particular rule.
Well, look, Peter says I'm gloomy, but people ask me what was it like being on the advisory panel and seeing the white paper up close, and the answer I always give it is that it was everything I expected it to be.
Truly an unforgettable experience. Mike Green, are you able to trump Andrew's overall pessimism in your context?
You promised me Trump wouldn't come up this panel. Two points I'd make after listening to this really quite fascinating discussion over 2 days. And it's important as an American to hear how we're talked about. So the first observation is about how we were talked about. And in the first panel I heard yesterday when I arrived, Trump was a major theme in questions. I mean, for me, frankly, quite jarring questions about what it meant for nuclear extended deterrence for Australia's own nuclear option. And then I heard President Yudhoyono in a marvelous speech say something he would never say in Washington, which is the U.S. election in America is a major variable for our region. He would not say that in the U.S., but it's true. And then Alan, on the earlier panel, saying that right now the U.S. is just too tentative and certain, which I, as a former Bush official, I took certain gratitude and comfort in, because after I left the White House and came to conferences like this, what I heard was the Americans are too overconfident and unilateral. But it's true. I think the President Obama's interview with the Atlantic Monthly was, if you haven't read it, was disconcerting for American internationalists, because it wasn't very internationalist. And an odd sort of end of the administration legacy interview to do. But for all those reasons, I think it's important to say something for a minute about where the U.S. is. I left the White House and spent about 8 years deep in archives studying the history of American strategic thought about Asia since 1784. And it really begins in 1784 when the Empress of China, the first ship, went from New York to Canton. And the common view is that our presidential election reveals some deep isolationism that's always been there and that may be coming out. And I just don't think that's right. I think Mr. Trump is speaking to a Republican constituency that wants to change social policy back several decades. 90% of his supporters, 90% say they are not satisfied with the way their society is changing. It's more than the economy, that's the driving force. And he can't do it. Bernie Sanders supporters are frustrated that the Democratic Party can't continue expanding the social welfare state, and it can't. So Sanders promises huge outlays of expenditure, and it's not going to be done. But these debates are not fundamentally about isolationism versus engagement. They're not smart enough to be that. So as Mark Twain once said of the music of Richard Wagner, it's not as bad as it sounds. And if you dig a little deeper, you'll see in polling, for example, recent polling, a majority of Americans support free trade. The only time that was not the case was right after the the Lehman shocks, the financial crisis, but it's come back up. A majority of Americans for the past 5 years have said consistently, Asia is the most important region in the world to us, after the answer in these polls for decades being Europe. Walter Lippmann, the essayist in the years before World War II, said, the United States has isolationist tendencies towards Europe. George Washington's farewell address speech about foreign entanglements was about the old country. It was not about Asia. And Lippmann made this point in 1939. In 1940, there's this very famous poll by Gallup after the fall of France, where a majority of Americans said we should not get involved in the European war. And what people forget is, in that same poll, Americans were asked, should we pressure Japan more, even if it risks war? And the same number, about 70%, said yes. After the Syria red line, when President Obama reversed course, polls showed that a majority of Americans didn't want to get involved in the ground war in the Middle East. But that same month, there were polls done that showed that the highest number ever of Americans said if Japan or Korea are attacked, we should come to their defense. So I think we have problems, and we have a bizarre presidential election, but there is a much deeper well of internationalism, and especially towards Asia in the United States body politic than I think is appreciated, including by Americans. Every one of our alliances and partnerships is stronger in this region. Every one of our allies and partners' relationships with each other is stronger. The exception was Japan and Korea, but the North Koreans have helpfully solved that for us, at least in part. People talk about trade, and as Kim and others have pointed out, it's foreign direct investment that matters. And when you look at foreign direct investment figures, which is marriage, trade is dating. Foreign direct investment is marriage. It dwarfs the trade figures in terms of the trans-Pacific. And when you go to the Pentagon and you see officers, despite what I said about the lack of Asia expertise, with 2 or 3 or 4 stars, almost every one of them has had complex joint combined command experience in complex operations. When you're in Beijing and you see general officers in the PLA, the only thing you know for certain is every single one of them bribed somebody to get promoted. So there's a lot more strength there, and I think it bears saying. Kim would be better at it than I am. And then the last thing, the second point I wanted to make is, this is in the category of it's actually worse than you think. There's been a lot of talk, and I agree with it, about responding to China's coercion in the South China Sea by reinforcing the rule of law, reinforcing the international constituency for the rule of law, demonstrating that that's the prevailing norm across this region. There's one problem, and that is the tribunal arbitration in the Philippine case will come down in the next 2-3 months. It will almost certainly favor the Philippines, and China, I think, is very likely to take a physical step to demonstrate that it's a paper tiger. And I would argue it's probably going to be something in Scarborough, and it's probably going to be reclamation and another military base on a feature. It could be an ADIS, it could be something else. That's when we're going to have to decide how, whether our focus on rule of law and so forth is it's necessary, but is it sufficient? And I think we're going to have a very tough set of options to consider.
Mike, thank you. While I've still got you on the Trump hook to one extent, I'd like to ask, put him to one side. Is what we're seeing a sort of a disguised story about a sort of a long-term Republican descent into isolationism, and therefore American politics becomes almost divided between isolationists and internationalists?
I don't think so. I spent a lot of time with Republican members. A number of them have been through here. If you look at the new class of Republican senators, for example, many of whom were elected with a Tea Party label, they are the most internationalist cadre of senators we've had in decades, very focused on the Pacific. Dan Sullivan, senator from Alaska, was the Assistant Secretary of State for Trade. Cory Gardner, a senator from Colorado, is chair of the Asia subcommittee. And a lot of these rising Republican stars, with one foot in the Tea Party, are taking committee assignments in foreign affairs, and a lot of them are choosing Asia. And I think it's true in different ways in the House as well. The problem the Republican Party has is not in the new members coming into the Senate and to a lesser extent the House. The problem is the party is in a civil war. It's not a two-way civil war, it's a three-way civil war between social conservatives and then national security conservatives like myself, and then this new Trump phenomenon, which is a Rust Belt, blue collar, traditionally democratic kind of base. But I don't think it's about isolationism. In fact, if Trump is the candidate, and if the Democrats sweep the House and Senate, probably the Senate, possibly the House, I think you'll find the incoming class is more protectionist and more cautious on international intervention. The one area of really quite robust bipartisanship in foreign affairs, the most robust area right now, is Asia, and alliances, though.
Thank you. And Tim, let's get some last-minute thoughts from you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, after reading the white paper in some detail and listening to the debates and participating in them over the last day and a half, it strikes me that the white paper is a solid and comprehensive document. It reflects an impressive long-term perspective from government on Australia's defence and security interests. It's clear that there's strong support across the Australian political establishment for Australia to strengthen its already strong defence effort. There are planned major investments, particularly in maritime capabilities, which are truly impressive. And I'm also struck by the comprehensive nature of the white paper, covering the full spectrum of not just existing but emerging security challenges and threats. But having said that, I'm also struck by the sense that this is an incremental white paper. It's gradualist in its approach. There are no radical departures. There's no step change in threat perceptions, in planned force structure, or in international and regional relationships. And my concern, and I think that there may be some others who feel this, judging by some of the comments over the last day and a half, is that global and regional developments, the global and regional threat environment are changing so fast, week by week, that the very sensible long-term defence plan outlined in the white paper may be superseded by events, and that could happen quite quickly. And being in the middle of Southeast Asia, of course, my focus recently has been on China's relentless efforts to enhance its position in the South China Sea. But there's also the question of the return of Russia as a strategic player, the fragile state of Europe, and just possibly an abrupt discontinuity in US policy. Unlikely, but it could happen. And more specifically, and this goes back to what I said before lunch, I think there is a question about whether Australia is engaging profoundly enough with regional political and defence establishments on strategic issues. As Paul Dibb said a short while ago, we're talking about the security of the northern approaches to Australia. They're now under serious challenge. And that challenge or threat has developed quickly over the last year or two. This might not be tangible in Canberra, but there is a real sense of concern in Southeast Asian capitals now over the way the regional environment is changing. And this is a sense that has only really developed within the last months. There are the beginnings now of a tentative diplomatic pushback from ASEAN, but as Paul suggested, this is unlikely to be sufficiently concerted to be effective, to paraphrase what he said. The time, I think, is now to start thinking about how to help Southeast Asian governments to construct a new regional security framework that doesn't have to be a direct challenge to ASEAN. It doesn't have to show disrespect to ASEAN. ASEAN can can go on, but there needs to be a more effective regional security framework. And on a broader canvas, I think that raises the question about the Asia-Pacific-wide security framework, and whether there's a case for more radical thinking about cooperation with the US and other allies. And for example, about whether US PACOM could become a multinational structure that would enable much closer and deeper cooperation between US, Australian, Japanese, and perhaps other forces.
Tim, thank you very much. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I do intend to go to the floor to give you one last opportunity to ask questions, but I'm going to put three quick questions to the panel, a little bit like speed dating, I suppose, Mike.
Why me? What?
No, well, not just you, not all three of you. For strategists, strategy panels are a little bit like speed dating for ugly people, I guess. And so there are three very quick questions that I'd like to get everyone's answers to. The first one is, so what have we forgotten? What has the white paper forgotten, or what have we forgotten to discuss in the last 2 days, which should have taken up more attention than it did? And Andrew?
Well, in terms of capabilities and investment proposals, we didn't forget anything. In fact, some things that shouldn't have got up did get up. The one thing I'm thankful for is that the jump jets jump jets weren't one of them.
We did forget them.
Yes.
Mike, what have we forgotten?
Well, if this conference were held in North Asia or Washington, we would have spent more time on North Korea, which is on the cusp of, or perhaps already has, a deliverable nuclear weapon that would threaten Japan and all of South Korea. That's a big deal in terms of the stress on our requirements and our commitment to extended deterrence and so forth. And that's an element that will ripple throughout the region.
Very good. Tim?
I'm not sure I'd say that the white paper has forgotten anything, but one element that I think maybe was missing from our discussions over the last 2 days has been to listen directly to some Southeast Asian perspectives, to hear more about what the Vietnamese and Singaporeans and Malaysians think about what's happening in their region. I think we were very privileged to hear an Indonesian perspective from President SBY, but I think more regional perceptions would be useful as well.
I mentioned it yesterday that I find it surprising that terrorism or counter-terrorism was such a limited part of the discussion, and given that it is the number one operational focus, it strikes me as a little odd that we seem to have this disconnect between our operational activities and where we want to put our strategic attention. But again, that may just be an artefact of where the dollars go, I guess, more than anything else. Okay, my next quick question then goes to black swans. That's not so much the things we've forgotten, but what are the utterly remote contingencies or events which might take place that could undermine the assumptions that the white paper has been based on, and force us to have to think in very different terms about what our defence and strategic interests might be. I just wonder if you gentlemen have any thoughts about what some black swans might be. Andrew?
Okay. One of the things that comes to mind is significant internal turmoil within China. Noting that 5 of the 10 bloodiest conflicts in history have been Chinese civil wars, and the nature of the Chinese political system, I don't know that we can take a smooth extrapolation forward.
Well, in spite of everything I said earlier, the black swan that worries me most is a Trump presidency, but it would not be a presidency that would execute what you're hearing out of the candidate's mouth. It would be a presidency in complete chaos and turmoil because there's no institutional basis to do what the candidate has said. So it would be a year or 2 or 3 of sort of returning to the norm. I agree on China. The other one, of course, is global deflation.
I'm not sure if you can have an orange black swan, but I think I know what you mean, Mike. Tim, what do you think of as black swan events?
I think a sudden Chinese land grab in the South China Sea, or in the Senkakus, a land grab aimed at islands and features occupied by other claimants.
Gee, well, all three are pretty alarming possibilities. My final speed dating question is, so what advice would you offer to the next white paper team? Andrew?
Don't do it. No, look, I think the single best piece of advice I think you could give any white paper team is try to keep the ambitions realistic.
Mike, your system produces quadrennial reviews, so I mean the name is different, but the agony is pretty much the same.
In theory, we should have a national security strategy from the White House, and following from that, historically, has been a quadrennial defense review, guidance to the force. If I had a suggestion for white paper, which I really think is quite, by international comparison, is quite robust, quite strong, where I see some slight inadequacy is where defense pulled their punches because it was DFAT's lane. And a national security level guidance, creating the grand strategy, the logic for why you're doing things with Japan and so on and so forth should, I would think, logically start the process. But having said that, our recent national security strategies haven't done that at all. Right. So it's a hard thing to do.
Okay, thank you. And Tim?
Well, maybe my suggestion is a bit of a contrast to Andrew's, but perhaps think less realistically, think more widely in terms of contingencies, and perhaps think about more radical changes to force structure to suit the ADF for a much wider range of contingencies.
I must say some of the advice that Andrew and I and other members of the external panel offered was adopted and I think will have an impact on how some future white papers are written. One is the sort of permanently established costing methodology, which I think is going to make it much easier to arrive at that attempt at a fully costed force structure approach. The second was also mentioned by one of our military panellists this afternoon around the almost permanent requirement for a force structure analytical capability within the organisation so that we don't sort of reinvent it every time. But I think it's an interesting question to put whether or not the white papers as we know them can continue into the future. I mean, this was a successful endeavour, but it took 2 years, 2 Prime Ministers, 3 Ministers for Defence to actually land this document. And as I indicated yesterday, Chinese land reclamation had only barely begun at the time the process was underway. So we need a method to think through our strategic options that actually operates at least as fast as the strategic developments that we're purporting to analyse. And it seems to me we're going to have to think hard about what that means for the production of these, rather elaborate policy instruments over time. Well, colleagues, we've got about 10 minutes before I want to wrap up proceedings. And so I'm now going to throw the floor open to individuals to ask questions or offer thoughts. Rob Asen, you're first up.
Thanks very much. We've talked a lot about the rules of the system, but one of the rules of the Asian sort of security system since about 1979, when there was a brief border clash between Vietnam and China, is that we don't have major powers involved in armed conflict in any violent way, and we're trying to deal with the terms of the peace. How do you adjust the behaviour of actors without actually going into that armed conflict situation, even though you may need to actually show the willingness to do that? It's one of the conundrums, right? But I guess my should my takeaway from this conference be that unwritten rule over the last 38 years that we don't have major power armed conflict in Asia is actually, we think it's that increasingly that is likely to be broken, and therefore what does that mean for our notion of maintaining the unwritten rules of that system?
Mike, maybe I'll throw that one to you first.
You know, despite the problems we have with China and they're mounting, and Kim was absolutely right earlier when he said this is probably going to get harder and it's going to last. This is a 5-10 year problem. All of that said, and despite Xi Jinping's straying from the dung maxim of bide your time, hide your strength, despite all of that, it is really very fundamental to China's national strategy to avoid conflict with the United States. A conflict that PLA senior leadership knows they would lose, at least for the next 10, 15 years. So I think major wars, major conflicts unlikely. And historically, if you look at why major powers, and particularly rising powers, clash with status quo powers, it's not a bolt out of the blue fight over an island or speck. It's because the peripheral straits between them are weak and attract intervention. That's why the U.S. went to war with Japan, because of the European imperial system collapsing in Southeast Asia. It explains a lot of wars. And that's why our strategy really, as Tim and others have pointed out, has to be about investing in the success of Indonesia and these other states. Part of it's capacity building. The one thing we, the United States, Australia, Japan, have on our side is we are now the powers that represent a belief in their sovereignty. Their sovereignty, their success is fundamental to our security, which is why they're all strengthening ties with us. So it's a longer game, and it's really about, ASEAN, South Pacific. This is, if we can shore up that area, we'll be able to avoid major conflict.
Thank you. Tim, did you want to add?
Yes, thanks, Peter. Well, of course, not all major power conflicts start intentionally, and I agree with Michael that the PLA will not be in a position to think that it could fight a conflict with the US and win, except in the long term. But that doesn't rule out the possibility of accidental escalation as tensions rise in the region. So I think there should be a premium on very clear communications, and I think it's important that the Chinese should understand the extent to which their actions are causing problems for regional states and are seriously challenging the interests of the United States and its allies. Because otherwise there's a danger of inadvertent conflict.
Thank you. We've got a question from General Jim.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Several years ago, a CDF asked me if I would do a study, because it's sometimes hard to criticise our own government when the government is still in power, to do a study on the British involvement in the Iraq War. Starting from 1998, from the Strategic Defence Review, and I did that study, and all the way through with Blair and Brown and the involvement of everyone and how the operations went. The study disappeared into the organisation and didn't really get anywhere, but it really comes down to what we're trying to talk about here, taking the SDR in those stages, and Tim, I may get some of these facts wrong, from the page to reality and how badly you can get it wrong. Having reduced the British forces to a very logical level, based on a number of assumptions in '98, the same Prime Minister then committed the Brits to a very serious invasion of another country, tried to work that force down, at the same time committed them to involvement in Afghanistan, in another country, on the assumption that the first country, Iraq, would be able to reduce its forces, got caught in both countries, and then found that they had totally overcommitted his own military, and found that the equipment of that military, the number of that military, the lack of helicopters, lack of armed forces, resulted in the fact that British generals were lined up outside the Chilcot inquiry to do a job on Prime Minister Blair. if that is the basic story, Tim, from another time where another country has tried to take the page from the page to reality, do you think we've learnt it all? The black swan in this is the fact that we could be at war in 2 or 3, 4 years, and I think you were getting at that before. Sometimes we do this without considering the fact that we may be at war. You know, the risk that we're taking between now and about 10 or 12 years when we get most of or some of this equipment is a pretty high risk. Thank you.
Andrew, perhaps I'll go to you.
Look, I couldn't agree more, Jim, and a comment that Mark and I made in a blog post the other day. What an extraordinary disconnect there is between the strategic rationale to double the size of the submarine fleet and the amount of time it's going to take to do it. You know, the strategic impetus is there to invest that money to get that capability, but it's okay, we'll have it in 2050.
Other colleagues, do you want to add?
No, except I agree.
You know, one of the problems, Jim, as someone who's sort of amateurishly dabbled in a number of white papers over the years, I sort of reflect on the impossibility of the task to, you know, think 2 decades ahead, you know, around any set of strategic circumstances. And the thought does occur to me that most often what white papers are writing about when they talk about, you know, 2035 or 2050 is really now or the short-term future. Because that's the only thing that we can, you know with any real degree of certainty. And I think it just points to the need for strategists to be modest people, basically, because the limitations of our knowledge are such that, you know, we have no guarantee that the core of those strategic assumptions will survive any great length of time. Now, there's one last question, which is Malcolm Davis. You're sort of hiding. Can I ask you to move a little to my right? You're basking in a halo of golden glow there, Malcolm. But go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Peter. A question really to Tim, but also to the rest of the panel. Tim, you mentioned in your presentation, and we talked about it last night, that you felt that the white paper was too conservative, wasn't radical enough in terms of potential force structure, capability development or strategy and so forth. So can I get you to speculate on, firstly, on if you were going to write a radical paper, what sort of capabilities would you think about? What sort of strategy changes would you think about? And secondly, more broadly to the panel, what sort of events or developments would need to occur in order to make a radical white paper more justifiable?
Malcolm, that's an easy question to answer. No, seriously. I mean, that's a huge question. I think the danger is getting into a situation where events may happen, and then there suddenly needs to be a very quick catch up in terms of capability. So I suppose the answer is, and this follows on from Peter's point, that the quicker the new capabilities can be brought into service, the better. And in terms of what sort of major event could precipitate the need for substantially stronger and wider capabilities. Well, some sort of limited clash, say in the South China Sea, involving China, or in the East China Sea, or a new confrontation between China and Taiwan. In terms of the sort of capabilities, well, I think you and I have talked about some of these. The question of nuclear submarines, and there are wider nuclear issues as well. But that depends on the future of the alliance relationship.
If you're so concerned about this, where is in the white paper
was asking about where is the expansion base and mobilisation planning. Yeah, it's not in the white paper, Paul. It's, I guess, the short answer to the question. Did you guys want to expand on Malcolm's
Can I answer the previous question?
Yeah, sure.
It stumped me, and the neurons have been firing, and I think I have a partial answer. The U.S. Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps that won Desert Storm was put in place in '75 by a Defense Department that was thinking about the Fulda Gap. And so inevitably, there's a long time before you field these systems, but the trajectory is usually not too far off. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is it may take 20 years to create this submarine force, but one of the maxims they teach at the war colleges in the U.S. is that jointness equals capability. And the amount of time it takes to create greater jointness is considerably less. And in the interim period there, I think Australia and the U.S. are in a very good position to begin to create the kind of interoperability and jointness that is deterrence, that does equal to some extent capability. So that's a partial answer to a very, very good question that still has mostly stumped me, but I wanted to put those two on the table.
Yeah, look, I'll just take up Malcolm's question. If you want to be agile, be able to be creative, innovative, do something radical in future, don't lock things in now. If we make the judgment now that surface combatants are wonderful things, fine. Find a contractor, find a John White to go build them. But don't set yourself up to build them forever, which locks in a big swedge of future spending that you can't go and spend on something that suddenly becomes more important down the track. I think that so avoiding setting up long-term vested interests would be a good start. And while I'm in the business of offending people, let me offend the other half of the room. The culture that makes militaries so effective at what they do also tends to make them less effective at suddenly changing direction. There were still British generals in 1919 writing florid prose about how to revitalise the cavalry capability.
Of course, that culture is true in the public service as well.
Yes.
Well, colleagues, I'm going to bring this one to a close. I want to congratulate our panel for sustaining a high level of interest and engagement with the audience right up to the end of what's been a fascinating 2 days. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please thank our panel?